The question we want to ask is if an engineer is looking at how I would look at building digital circuit design or analog circuit design, I want to understand my tool options because in theory I should be able to design in either way. So what are our options? Well, if I have digital design, the designer begins and looks at the digital design problem, sort of looks around, goes to her desk, and realizes there is a whole region of design tools available from high level to going all the way to layout. This is great. This enables all sorts of different digital chips to be built and is the center of many of our infrastructure. For analog design, the engineer looks around, gets to her desk, and looks at the tools and realizes we might have a problem. In fact, mostly we get to do custom design, simply layout, simulation, maybe DRC and LVS. So what to do in this case? Here's the weird thing. Chips get done anyways, and you wonder, well, how did this happen? And so, seriously, how does this happen? Well, imagine the designer starts with a high-level sort of mixed signal architecture file and tries to think about the design. Well, what do? Well, you assemble a team. Well, for a structure of moderate size, you're getting a bigger team, a lot bigger team. And then you begin to start to build, and you begin to work through your design the first month. Second month, you're doing simulation. You start thinking through the layout, working through details. And the third month, you start doing a lot more layout, lots of sim. The team starts getting a little more edgy. By the fourth month, you kind of wonder what day it was again. By the fifth month, you're trying to remember you had sunlight. The team's getting a little more edgy. And then at month 6, you're almost done. Actually, then you finally tape out. And you have your happy team to work with. Okay. You can imagine the designer is actually starting to dream of the question of what would happen about taking that high-level design, the high-level structure and architecture and work, and just say, could I just put this into a computer and just tape it out? Even better if this could just happen in hours to a few days. That would be great. And so we begin to ask, is any part of this dream even possible? Just even in part would be an amazing improvement. Well, what could really change this picture when we were looking at this earlier? One of the biggest things is saying if I had an analog standard cell library, much like I have for digital structures, that could change the conversation. Because at that point, I could imagine having maybe some tools, maybe some place and route, maybe some other concepts similar to what I'm used to doing digitally that might give me a chance to make this work. This is what I'm hoping for. So, okay, let's just make an analog standard cell library. That shouldn't be any problem, right? Well, the problem is that analog design tends to be rather artistic. So you have your designer starts to work on their design and they make a nice amplifier. Perfectly good amplifier, really works with the specs, no problem, until their friend comes walking along, looks at it, not particularly happy as most artists might be, actually gets kind of concerned and then starts to have their own structure and then starts to draw and makes an amplifier that person thinks is better. Unfortunately, both of them are probably very similar amplifiers and either one of them probably could have worked. And so this is the artistic nature we run into in analog design. So as a result of this, we probably just want to agree that analog and mixed signal design just kind of a lost cause. There's not much hope here. Well, I think there's another possibility, and this is where I would entertain this, that we could talk about configurable analog structures, which might include having various tools and how to actually, and the question is, are there tools? And then this is really enabled by having things built in an educational space and really enabling it with programmable analog. So maybe we have a way forward. Let's see. So configurable analog, we often talk about things like field programmable analog arrays or large-scale field programmable analog arrays, which are really, sort of the mixed signal equivalent of FPGAs. Basically, you've added analog into the system. So that works well. And yet FPGAs are more than FPGAs because the routing infrastructure actually is somewhere that you can do computing depending on how you set up your switches and your switch topology. In particular, you look at these floating gate devices and you start thinking about analog programmability, things that are done, and all of this done in a standard CMOS that could be done in the same crossbar that you would expect to do just the simple routing. And so therefore, what you find is that switches are not dead weight in this architecture. So these floating gate elements in standard CMOS are incredibly powerful from all sorts of ranges of technology. Now, someone might actually argue, but do these even work? And the answer is yeah, these have been working for 25 years or so at this point. And what kind of makes this interesting is that there's been a huge amount of work on these FPA devices, almost 20 years of work, certainly from the Georgia Tech perspective, of building floating gate based FPA devices to where now it's routine to have 1 million programmable parameters. This is pretty incredible stuff. On the other hand, you begin to look at the sort of core elements, which we call CABs, or computational analog blocks. Their design is more or less converged. And this is kind of interesting over many of the different architectures, which begins to ask the question, do we have fundamental blocks in these architectures? And things that we routinely use, and we might imagine these are the things we'd want to be working with. And what we also realize is that analog has many abstraction layers. What we would see is that if you were to look at sort of a simple bandpass filter, what you would see at the left is made up of a whole bunch of different components and elements of all of these abstractions are both intellectually reasonable as well as you see these abstractions in the FPA itself. And further, you can actually just make the test setup and you realize you have another whole set of sequences of abstractions for voltage sources and as well as mixed signal structures that would include a processor. So there is definitely a capability of abstraction in this system. And there are tools, much to the surprise of this. And if you think about having 1 million parameters, you want tools. And as a result, you can have a structure with just a laptop and a board and maybe a very simple analog structure and have a fully working lab. And if you look at the tools themselves, what you end up seeing is actually a high-level block description, which you see in the middle. You have a full control GUI, everything built into an open source Ubuntu structure that you can then say, let me make a spiking neuron and actually get experimental measurements out of that spiking structure. What really makes a difference here is the fact that these have been used in education and teaching aspects at Georgia Tech for more than 20 years in one form or another. And in teaching this, actually allows a lot of students to look at this. It allows us to have a lot of design problems that you can actually do in a week or 2 weeks and get experimental results. It really allows you to ask what is abstraction, but it also says what is possible what are people's imaginations striving for. And we're finding that this sort of convergence of core cells, it remains even in this case. And this has happened over hundreds of undergraduate and graduate students that have been taught in this perspective. So as a result, you can start to imagine defining an analog standard cell library and really looking at a number of elements that are transconductance amplifiers, transistors, comparators, as well as some special cells and so forth. These are all cells that you would imagine would show up out of these FPA structures. These are all structures that turn out to have a huge impact in terms of being able to be used in many, many places. And as a moderate number of cells, we could certainly have more, but this is an expandable starting point. And so intellectually, this seems to be the right place. And the next question is, well, how on earth can you account for all the transistor sizes, circuit topologies? Where are your passives? You can't possibly do analog design without this. And that begins to set us into a much larger question. And would actually go back to a conversation at ISCAS 2 years ago in talking about what are certain key questions that are needed to cross over into system level analog design. Part of this is being essential is talking about programmable design. Part of it is talking about what happens with floating gate elements to get linearity, which is in terms of the inputs. And it sort of changes the way in topologies that you might use for design. So threshold-based centric circuits, even though you might use above threshold, you use that as your framework, and you build in configurable design techniques. And all of this kind of is built from an educational framework. When you look at analog transform through programmability, you realize you might start with transconductance capacitor type techniques, which are really good in terms of highly efficient design. But you need to then deal with programmable linearity and offsets. Would be the classic worries. But it turns out you can actually get programmability with the floating gate elements, particularly say bias currents. And on top of that is you can actually get linearity and offset compensation by actually having floating gates on the inputs of these structures where that's helpful. So it kind of works out that, yeah, we can kind of do this, and it changes the perspective because all the time constants and other aspects can all be tuned. You don't need to necessarily have precise gains in a particular place because the programmability allows you to work through this. And so this changes the dynamic that you look at. Now you could imagine if you had your FPA, you'd say, well, look, I've got a whole bunch of elements in routing. And you start to think this feels like the structure I would want for a standard cell with both having pitches and amplifier structures. And this is precisely what you see, that you can actually imagine a couple or maybe even one vertical size. And then, the horizontal size will be variable. And you can actually get particular floating gate tracks in different places for the programmability. It actually allows you to have regular compilation of a custom structure, a custom block, but actually a whole new FPA structures potentially could be compiled. And you could imagine having a whole set of heterogeneous cells, all with sort of different size pitches that you can do. There might be bigger blocks or there'd be crossbar networks to put together. And then you also have programming tracks running orthogonally in a reasonable place to make these things work. And you could imagine this for custom design, fully custom design, maybe customizing configurable pieces in that design, and so forth. And so what we get to at the end is that a useful standard cell library looks like it's possible. And it looks like we have the intellectual framework to make this work. And this has really been based and driven by actually doing a lot of educational development and a lot of hands-on use of these cells to make this possibly happen. And so we've really talked about what are the core cells for this. And having this sort of core analog standard cell library, it looks like there's real possibilities to compile this down all the way from high level down to layout, allowing for sensor to end sort of computing kind of results to make happen. We're currently in the process of developing this library in multiple IC processes, and I'm happy to talk about that, and having a system that looks like it should be able to integrate with sort of modified design tools, digital design tools that we might already be able to find, ideally in an open source space. So with that, I really thank you for watching the video, and know that comments and questions are certainly welcome, and I really appreciate that. And I kind of expect questions are going to happen. I expect a lot of questions are going to happen.